I want to give you one other source on Tohu Vavohu. So if you don't mind, please go with me over to the book of Isaiah, chapter 34. Isaiah chapter 34. So Isaiah is before Jeremiah. This is the prophecy against Edom. And it's a very, very horrible prophecy, very, very vivid. And if you look at chapter 34, Isaiah chapter 34, verse 8, it says in English, it is a day of vengeance for God, a year of retribution for the grievance of Zion. So apparently, Moab has joined in the destruction of Zion, and now Edom is going to receive its due. It says here, its rivers will turn to tar, its soil to sulfur, its land will become burning tar. Night and day, it will not be extinguished, meaning the fire. Its smoke will ascend forever. Ledor medor, from generation to generation, the land will be desolate, for no one traverses it. Verse 11. Owls and bitterns will occupy it. Great owls and ravens will dwell in it. And he will draw against it a line, an emptiness and plumb bobs of void. Now, emptiness, the line and the plumb bobs. I'll go now to the Hebrew in verse 11. It says, Vinata aleha kav tohu va'avne vohu. Vinata aleha kav tohu va'avne vohu. So what is a kav and what is the stone? In building, in the engineering of building, a kav was a line that you strung to make sure that the surface was horizontal, and the plumb line is a line you dropped with a stone at the bottom to make sure that the wall was truly vertical. So you needed the kav and the even, the line and the plumb, to make sure that the wall was right. Now look what Isaiah does. He says in verse 11, God lays out nata, which is another creation word that we will see in Psalm 104. Nata aleha kav tohu, that the kav is tohu and the even is bohu, meaning the laws of physics no longer work. You lay out a line to make sure your building is, whatever you're building is horizontally straight, it's not going to work. You'll lower a plumb line to make sure that the wall is vertical, it's not going to work. So this idea in this desolate land that there's tohu vavohu, things can't be built. The laws of physics aren't working. Engineering is no longer a science. So now you're getting a sense of tohu vavohu. Geometrical tools don't work. Everything is chaotic. The land is destroyed. I think Isaiah 34 somewhat matches over on Jeremiah 4. So when we go back to our verse, tohu vavohu, you say, oh, since it's the first verse of the Bible, that's the first time these words occur. Okay, so you want to get that idea out of your head. Whoever wrote the first verses of the Bible already knew the terms. Jeremiah already had read Isaiah. I think Jeremiah had already used the terms in Jeremiah 4:23, and he was using words that he used in order to write Genesis 1. So although from the perspective of the canon, we read it in order, don't assume what we have in the Bible is written in the order that we have it, nor that the things that we find in the Bible, that's the first time it appears. The first time it appears, if we can even use such a term, might be in another text, and then the editor of the Bible used that phrase to bring into this text. So technically, there is no precise order in the Bible. You have to find out who wrote what when, with what words. Were those words used somewhere else? We bring them into then we study them in our context, and then we look at them in another context, and that's how we understand what words mean. This is a very important thing. How do we know what the words of the Bible mean? You have to look at their meaning in a different context, in another context, and from them create some kind of theory of the word. That if a word is used in a roughly similar way, then you look at these different contextual clues to understand what the word means here. So I can't emphasize enough how much Jeremiah, in beginning his poem of creation, started with tohu vavohu, borrowing from Jeremiah 4:23 and borrowing from the book of Isaiah chapter 34. I think that was verse 9. Now, then it goes on. The eris was tohu vavohu. There was darkness on the face of the abyss, and a spirit of God, or a spirit of God, meaning not God's spirit, but a spirit that belonged to God, as if God emanated a spirit, was hovering over the face of the water. Now, these are terms that come to play again. Remember, tahom means the abyss. In Hebrew, water under the surface of the earth are called mei tahom, the water table. So tahom means water down below. So they're using the idea that there is water down below, the mei tahom, but then it's hovering over the face of the water. So what we have you is a chaotic scene of undifferentiated water, of darkness and so forth. So we see this as a scene created to impart a sense of meaning. Now, true to Jeremiah chapter 4, 20, 22, 23, 24, where there's no light in the sky, the divine creates light. It says, Vayomer Elohim, the divine speaks, says, there will be light. And here's where there's a really interesting thing where the divine doesn't say, I created it so that it will be good, but the divine notices that it is good. Again, these are things I said last time, but I want to make sure to do a little review. This is a long review each time, and then so as I move on. So the divine notices that the world is good, which leads us to the question, does it have intrinsic good on its own, or is it only good because God created it? This seems to say that God noticed the intrinsic good of what had been created. It had some kind of power or will of its own. Again, I'm not trying to make a theological statement. I'm just reading the Hebrew. God saw that it was good. God didn't say, I will create it to be good. The Hebrew could do that. That's not what the Hebrew did. Now, the rest of Genesis 1 is actually quite readable, and you can all read it with any good translation, maybe some good commentary. I only want to point out the things that, for me, add the great substance to the poem. Just one thing Avigal and I were talking about, and this is in Genesis chapter 1, verse 6. Vayomer Elohim, and Elohim says, Yehi rakia betoch hamayim. Now, what is a rakia? Rakia is, in its non-metaphoric sense, is a hammered out tin plate that separates things. You put things above the plate, below the plate. Rakia came to mean a reka is a background. And so when you think of the rakia firmament, it's well to understand it as something that keeps the sky. Then we have the atmosphere, and then we have the earth. So the rakia keeps the upper water from flooding the lower realm. Now you notice this is reversed in the Noah story. So the Noah story is in many ways a commentary on the first chapter of Exodus. So the original state of cosmos is chaos. The light comes, and the story is reducing the chaos. And I believe that all of this is being written for several reasons, but one to know that chaos hovers, that chaos is the original cosmic nature of things. Therefore, the chaos continues in the universe, the chaos continues within us, and all it takes is a moment when the chaos can reassert itself. I think that's something that Jeremiah is saying, that the fabric of the cosmos is chaos. It takes the divine light and the divine will, and therefore human light and human will, to keep the chaos at bay, as we of course see throughout history and our current history. All right, so the story goes through. I jumped last time to the creation of the human being, where it says, Naaseh, now we're in verse 26. Vayomer Elohim Naaseh Adam B'Tzalmenu Kidibutenu. Let us make the human being in our image, in our likeness. I was always taught, why does it say let us make? It's the royal we. My Christian friends said, no, this was the Trinity talking. And then I heard someone speak on the Divine Council many years ago, and this idea that there's a divine council with whom God consults. So where do we see this? We see this in 1 Kings 22, 19 to 34. We don't have to go there now, but make a note of it. 1 Kings 22, where the divine is trying to decide some course of action against King Ahab. And he says to his legions, does anybody have an idea? And the text says one said this and one says this. And finally, the member of the divine council says, Rucha or Ruach says, I know what to do. And God says, well, tell me what it is. And Rucha says, well, I'll go down and I'll make all the prophets lie. So Ahab won't have anybody to depend on. And then he'll go to war and get killed. And Elohim says, great, go do it. So now we see the word Elohim refers both to a divine council and it refers to the divine. It's used in two different ways. So when it says Naaseh Adam, this would seem to be the divine council saying, let us make, because it uses the word make, let us make a being in our image, in our tselem. One thing I pointed out last time, this idea of we're created in God's image, tselem Elohim, that's a really great thing. There's a human rights organization called B'Tselem, and it's a strong teaching. Abraham Joshua Heschel uses it, and it's a valorized term, except when you then go and look at the source of the term. And again, this is, I think, the last time I'll have you have to traverse your Bibles to get it, but we're going to go over to Psalms verse 34, because I want you to see that when you look up how Isaiah chapter 34, the minute you take a word, for example, B'Tselem in the image, and you say to yourself, well, where else did B'Tselem occur? Right? Um, um, I'm sorry, 39. 34 was the Tohu Bohu. Isaiah 39. So, I don't have the right. All right, I don't have the right citation listed. Oh, I'm sorry, Psalms 39. Psalms 39. Psalms 39. I have a note to go to Psalms 39. So I can't read my own handwriting. Here we go. Here we go. You ready? Psalm 39. This is a pretty dark psalm. When you're looking for inspiration, don't read Psalms 39. If you want to warn someone else of the horror of life, read them Psalms 39. It says the following. Verse 6, behold, like a handbreadth have you made my days. My lifetime is nothing before you. It's complete futility, all human existence. Verse 7, only in shadowy darkness does man make his way. It is but futility for which they are in turmoil. He amasses riches, but he knows not who will take them in the end. So we go over to the Hebrew. He says, Ach betzelem yitalech ish. Now, in this translation, tselem, meaning image, means deep darkness. Okay, deep darkness. Why? The Hebrew word sel means darkness. Tselem, the mem at the end, intensifies a word. So if sel means shadow or darkness, tselem is intense darkness. Where do we see this in Psalm 23? It says, Gam ke'elech ba ge tzal mavet. So see, you have the tzadid lam mem. It probably doesn't say tzal mavet. It probably says tzalamut. So tzel, tselem, tzalamut all imply darkness. Now, it does mean image, but it also means deep darkness. So now when we go to our verse, and let's say that those who heard the story, they knew of Isaiah, they knew of Jeremiah, they knew Psalms, and when they say, Naaseh Adam B'Tselmenu, it put everybody on edge. Because it could also mean the divine council saying, let's create the human being in our darkness. Let's create the human being in this, Psalm 39 with the sense of the futility of the human being. So on one hand, it does mean image, but there's an undercurrent of something very disturbing. Now, remember, this is Jeremiah. So does Jeremiah want to communicate to us a double meaning? On one hand, yes, you are in the image of Elohim. On the other hand, the word Selim is a word that can go a couple of different ways and not very hard to look it up. So what I'm sharing with you is Jeremiah is writing something with a kind of an existential dread to it. It's both a creation story, but also includes the dreadful nature of the human condition, of which we all know. Yes, we're created in the divine image. That's a wonderful thing. But the word used also means shadowy darkness. And when we go to Psalm 39, it's a place of futility. Our days are of naught. We amass things and we don't know who's going to get them in the end. So when you read the Hebrew words and go to other sources of the Hebrew words, it doesn't tell us what it means. It tells you it's called a range of meaning. And that's something my Bible teacher and other teachers of text interpretation taught me. When you're studying words in literature, you don't ask yourself, what does it mean? You say, what are the range of meanings? And then as you read the poem, you see poems have a range of meanings. And that's why it's so hard to translate a poem, because you can't translate ranges of meanings. That's what I'm doing for you is I'm giving you the ranges of meanings in the Genesis story. It becomes deeper and deeper and a little more troubling as we go along. So it says, we shall make the human being tsalmenu kidimutenu at our image. By the word image also has a tough uh, uh, um, the text where we have kidimut also is a little bit troublesome. And what's this human being going to do? By the way, Adam is a species, not a person. It's not his name. It's a type of a being. He's going to rule over the creation so far. And then it says, Vayivra Elohim. So if the divine council says, we shall make man, then Elohim actually does the making, because you have the word bara, which is only used with the divine. Vayivra Elohim et ha'adam, creates the human being, bitsalmo, in his image, also can mean dark shadow image. B'Tselem Elohim bara oto, in the image, shadow of the divine, he made him. Zachar u'nekeva, a male and female. Their commandment is pru uravu, to be fruitful and multiply. And fruitful multiply is introduced with the words in verse 28, Vavarech otam Elohim vayomer. So Elohim blesses them. So what happens when you're blessed? Immediately become fruitful and multiply. All right, that's a pretty long overview from last time to, to show you the depths of it and also how it is enriched if you look at other words in source. So I'll take a brief pause here and I go on to my next paragraph of thought, and Rabbi Manning.
Thank you, Rabbi. Quick question. So given this, the range of meaning, including darkness and shadow for B'Tselem, could then God injecting with God's breath a neshama, is the neshama, in a sense, an antidote to the darkness and the shadow? And of course, then we have Ner Adonai Nishmat Adam. So is the neshama an antidote for this kind of negative idea of darkness and shadow?
Okay. Clear question. So if we, for a moment, don't read Bible like I'm recommending that we read it, which is that Genesis chapter 2 is written by an entirely different author from Genesis chapter 1. But whoever put it together wanted us to think that. But let's put that aside for a moment. Genesis chapter 2 is by another author. So when let's say, I don't know, pick an author today. Emily Dickinson writes a poem that has this in it, and Rilke has a poem that writes that in it. And if they put it into an anthology, and someone says, well, look, in this anthology, Rilke writes this, but Dickinson writes that. Does that not mean that Dickinson is trying to help us see things from a different Rilke? Well, in this anthology, yes, because they're right next to each other. But originally, you read Rilke on his own, you read Emily Dickinson on her own, and you don't ask how they're reading into each other. because they're not being written to be reading into each other. So, in the perspective of the canon, meaning now that it's all set, is that a fair way to read it? Sure. But that's not what I'm teaching. What I'm teaching is I want us to look at this poem by a certain individual using certain language to communicate certain ideas and not look for another verse in the Bible to relieve us of the existential dread. That's what we do when the whole thing's set. We read the whole canon and all the verses speak to each other. This is the path of Midrash, the path of the Talmud. Everything is speaking to each other once the canon is set. But before the canon is set, each text exists separately. So no, I could be wrong, very wrong. I don't think when Jeremiah wrote this, he wanted us to read this in the light of Genesis chapter 2. I don't believe that, but I could be wrong. So I
Could
think he
I?
actually wanted, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so very good. So reading it alone, it is a much darker origin story. And is it the same author that then wrote 6:6 that talks about, the evilness of man? Is it the same author with
That's
that?
straight up Jeremiah.
Okay, so that goes together with that.
Yes,
I had one other question
sure.
that I'd never thought of until you were talking tonight. We always read Breshit as in the beginning of, but couldn't it be in a beginning of?
It's not how it's used. Remember, words, what words mean by context. And when Jeremiah uses Breshit Malko in the beginning of the reigning of, it's always used as a specific thing in the beginning of a specific thing. In Jeremiah, when he uses Breshit, it's always the specific beginning of the reign of a specific king. So again, I depend on usage. And this is something when you say, well, what does words mean in context? Now, once you say, well, I'm going to forget usage and just pretend these words, kind of popped out of the mind so we can see that we want. Of course, I mean, they're free, as it were. But remember, one thing I'm teaching you is when you study the Bible, you want to read a word or a term or a phrase in the Bible and look in other places where it occurs. And when you see that, for example, only Jeremiah uses tohu vabohu, only Jeremiah uses bereshit, we're starting to land on an author. Um, you look B'Tselem, it occurs in Psalms. Does that fit with tohu vabohu? Does it fit with uh, the human being, uh, the 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 heart of the human being bent on evil all days long? So you begin to see there's an author named Jeremiah who edited the Bible, by the way, the first editing of the Bible, who wrote the first chapter, who therefore gave us the overture, the preface to the rest of the Bible. So now think a minute. If Jeremiah is the person that says, I'm going to put it together, I always, I have 20 cartloads of scrolls. I'm going to put them in an order. And Jeremiah says, we're missing a preface. I'll write it. And they go, wow. I mean, for me reading this is like somebody finally wrote Eleanor Rigby, probably the greatest song in rock and roll ever. And you listen to it now and you say, some guys were channeling something. So Jeremiah writes it, and his friends say, okay, you did not just write a preface to the Bible. You wrote something else. He goes, yeah, it's pretty good. Yeah, it's pretty good. Put it right in there. And then Jeremiah takes his Jeremiah attitude, and he's not writing the Bible, he's stitching it together. And every now and then you see some Jeremiah stitching, and you can see his hand. He has a very, very clear hand in how he stitches the Bible. So you start to see that the meaning of the Bible is partly shaped by how Jeremiah both edits the Bible and how he stitches parts of the Bible together. So it's a great, great artistry. Yes, you could do that, but remember, I'm saying Bereshit is a term used in Jeremiah for a very specific purpose. He's taking the purpose that he uses over in Jeremiah 44, for example, and brings it over here in Genesis chapter 1. All right, so now I want to get down to the Sabbath. Um, Now, I was asked last time, and in our class, and by the way, I ran all this by my Torah students as my beta run. So this is maybe a better than the beta, and eventually it'll be an A run through this text. Where does the idea of the Sabbath come from? And the answer is we just don't know. So I'll give you a bit of an introduction there. We'll read the text and maybe end for this morning, for for this evening. Uh, so the term sabadu or sapatu does exist in other texts, and it, I could stupefy you how much I've read on the origins of the Sabbath in Babylonian, Akkadian, and other literature. It is so dense and so complex. I'll try to give you the very bottom line. There seems to be a day, not the seventh day, it was the seventh, the 19th, the 21st, and so forth during a month. That was a day, uh, a dangerous day. So, for example, the king was not allowed to eat fine food on this day. The king was not allowed to make fire on this day. Uh, it was not a propitious day, so people did no activity on that day. That if you did activity on the day, the gods would frown upon it and make sure that whatever you did would fail. So it was a day of fear. It was a day where one did not want to offend the gods. The idea of the Sabbath, I'm just going to use the Hebrew term, also refers to a time when the God was refreshed. And when people discovered, they said, "Oh, we found the connection," of that God Shavat Vayinafash in Exodus 31. And then they translated more of the text, and it says, "God's anger was averted when people would propitiate the divine. The God at hand calmed down." So, is this the Jewish Sabbath? No, but so there's this huge background. Now we'll take it to our purposes. So here's where I want to give you a bit of an introduction. Um, the 7 day week is not connected to the sun, not connected to the moon. It has nothing in the calendar. And the ancient Kohanim, and you see this mostly in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're very concerned with the calendar. In fact, that is one of the main focuses of the priesthood in the Qumran scrolls. Now, the problem with the Sabbath is there's no way an astronomer can predict the Sabbath. And so the priest, whose expertise was looking at the sky, because the sky was the metaphysical world under which we live, and we're supposed to match our lives to the life of the sky, the full moons, and also the agricultural world. So if the sky is God's, as it were, first world, the earth is God's second world, and it has its own times and seasons and so forth, we're supposed to live in this world into which we were born, a world where there's already seasons, there's already new moons, and so forth. And then the human world comes into being in the context of this divine world. The only outlier is the Sabbath. So now I'm proposing an idea. This is, in a way, a crisis of the priesthood. Where did the Sabbath come from? Now, they probably knew of these Babylonian texts. And now you might say, here's where the Jewish ethos comes. If God created this ceasing day, it's not the day where we're afraid to do anything. That is a non-propitious day. It's a dangerous day. And it's not that the God rested from God's anger. You even have that in, of course, the Hebrew Bible as well. So I think they took something and they took the different various meanings and melded it together and created their own meaning. Now, I cannot overemphasize what a profound cultural artifact, therefore, the Sabbath is. This idea that a given culture inherits the cultural ideas of others and then says, but and collects it, but doesn't just imitate it. It collects the terminology and says, we're going to use this differently. We're going to take what you guys did, we're going to rework it, save some of the ideas, such as don't work, but not don't work because we'll offend you, but don't work because you gave us a gift of not working. So try to see the Sabbath as an invention of the ancient Israelite mind using the artifacts, let's say, of other cultures, and creating something brand new while still using some of the phrases and terminology of surrounding cultures. Nobody knows where the Sabbath came from, which tells me the people of Israel created it using the artifacts of other cultures that they, as it were, collected together and reworked it for their own purposes. So now what do we have? That the 7 day week is part of the cosmos. The divine created it. And now you can see that the 6 days of creation are somewhat arbitrary because the goal of the story is the seventh day. So I think what Jeremiah simply had to do was fill up the other 6 days any way that he wanted to, as long as we got to the seventh day. And the seventh day is created by Elohim, and therefore we now have the origins of the Sabbath, which is the divine will. Therefore, still a concern of the priests, because they're very much interested in order and how people observe things, not connected to the seasons, the sun, but something utterly unique of the divine will that both is a gift to humankind, meaning the idea of rest, but also a restriction of humankind when you look at the Ten Commandments and other places. So, what is the Sabbath? It's a day where you may not do what you want to do. You can't make your slave work in the Ten Commandments. You can't do any of your work in the Ten Commandments. So the whole impulse of the human being, homo faber, the creating human being, malacha, the toil, toil comes to an end. So does toil come to an end to not offend the gods? No. Toil comes to an end to imitate God. Think of the great reversal of the meaning. You're not hiding out by not working. You're becoming godlike by not working. So the ancient Israelite mind completely reversed the inheritance they got from the Babylonians, the Akkadians. I'm summarizing, of course, turned it into their own thing, what you might call the values of ancient Israelite religion, which is God loves humanity and gives us the gift of the Sabbath. Now, here's the most important thing. How does the Sabbath reverse tohu vavohu? I mean, if you begin with tohu vavohu and you end with the Sabbath, what do these bookends have to do with each other? Well, part of moral tohu vavohu is everyone does hayeshar be'enav. This is borrowed from the book of Judges. Why are things so bad in the book of Judges? Everybody does what is right in his own eyes. Hayashar be'enav. In the Bible, that's the worst state of affairs. Everybody does hayashar be'enav, what seems right in his own eyes, not restrained by a moral order. So part of the purpose of human beings is not to do whatever I want, not to hayashar be'enai, that which is right in my own eyes, but rather what is yashar according to the moral order. Now, how do we know there's a moral order? How do we know that there's a cosmic order? We're reminded every week. Every week you stop working because there's a cosmic order. Every week you give your slaves a day off and your animals a day off because there's a cosmic order. So the cosmic order restrains the human being from doing what they want to do. So human will is deferred to divine will. Now, whatever you want to call this, but the moment a person says, I feel like doing this, but I won't because it violates the moral law. Or sometimes when a person says to me, well, don't I have a right to my depression? I said, actually, from a Jewish perspective, you don't. I'm not saying it's not natural, but you have an obligation to work through it because life is created for goodness. It's not the divine will that you destroy yourself internally, but rather work through it and achieve human flourishing. It's the divine will. And so people say, yeah, from a liberal perspective, you feel anything you want. From a spiritual perspective, there are some things that violate the spiritual order, including not regulating your inner life to the point that you destroy yourself and other people. That is out of order. So try to imagine the Sabbath communicates the great order. So the Shabbat is the great order. If Tovavo is the great disorder, Shabbat is the great order. Now, we're going to look at the actual words that are said here. We move to chapter 2, verse 1. I'm not sure why those who divided the Bible into chapters, which was by the Catholic Church, not the rabbis, why they made the Sabbath part of the next chapter. Okay, I don't think it makes sense, but here it is. We'll take a look at the Hebrew. Vayechulu Hashemaim ba'aretz v'kol tzva'am. Now, vayechulu means brought to an end or completed, but on their own. So it's in the passive sense in Hebrew. Vayechulu. The word kuf lamed lamed, which means all, or kaf lamed lamed, which means all, kalal. Hakol means everything. And here, vayechulu means everything became completed. The heavens and the earth became completed, not using the active voice that God did it, but somehow on their own. Then it moves to the active voice. Vayechal Elohim b'yom hashvi'i. On the seventh day, God completed malachto asher asa, the malacha, the work, the toil that God had done, vayishbot, and he ceased on this day, bayom hashvi'i, mikol malachto asher asa, from all the toil. So God ceases on the seventh day. Why does God cease on the seventh day? Again, we're working backwards. There already was a day of secession. Why? There had been a day of secession since Babylonian times, but for the Babylonians, it was a time of fear. So there already was a day of secession. But what did the day of ceasing mean? The Bible here is asserting that the ceasing is because God ceased God's malacha. Therefore, cosmic ceasing is rooted in divine ceasing. Not God angry at us, not God bothering us when we're working on God's day, but rather God says, I'm ceasing, therefore you cease. It's a gift. So God ceases on the Sabbath day. Now, Vayvarech Elohim et Yom HaShvi'i, back to God blessing the human beings. What is, remember, bless means provide something with fertility, and now the Sabbath has a kind of fertility. God blesses the Sabbath day, sanctifies it. Remember, in sanctify, in biblical Hebrew, lekadesh means also to sanctify. Lekadesh also means to marry. In fact, when you get married, there's a part of the service called the kiddushin, where the ring is placed on the finger. So try to imagine it this way: God uh, um, blesses the seventh day and marries the seventh day. It's strange, but it is that somehow the divine and the Sabbath together produce something. It's the closest we get to a divine mate is the Sabbath. And why does God bless it and sanctify it? Because on that day, um, God shavat, Elohim shavat, from all of his toil, which he had created making. I'm not going to try to unpack that, but I want you to see that the Sabbath is the real point, the pinnacle of this story, as that which stands against Tohu Vavohu and takes a day of dread from the Babylonian tradition, makes it a day of divine cessation, which also has a strong social ethical dimension because the servants and the slaves are all don't work that day. Later on, or maybe at the same time, is connected to the Exodus from Egypt. And suddenly you realize the Sabbath is actually the most important day of the Jewish calendar. So when people say to me, what's the most important day of the Jewish calendar? Shabbat. Shabbat is the most important day because of this chapter and because of how it's used elsewhere. So I won't go into other references for the Sabbath. Let's go ahead and finish properly with Exodus chapter 31, where the Sabbath is the capstone of the building of the the orders of the building of the Mishkan. So remember, when Moses goes on Mount Sinai into our portion of Mishpatim, he's given all the moral and civil laws, a little bit of calendar. Next to our portion, Truma, it's the building of the Mishkan. We have in Exodus chapter 31 the designation of the architects, and then the Sabbath. Now, why do we have the Sabbath in Genesis 31? Because the malacha of building the Mishkan is understood to be something like the human beings building a cosmos. There's lots of literature on how the Mishkan reflects the cosmos. In fact, I think there are books by that name. So just try to imagine the Mishkan, the tabernacle we build, reflects cosmic reality. I'll make that case later on as we do these studies. And therefore, just as when God creates the cosmos, God has a Shabbat, so when human beings, at least the directions for the Mishkan are given, the laws of the Sabbath are given in a little bit different language. So in 31:12, speak to the children of Israel, you must observe my Sabbath. It's an oath, so it's a sign of the covenant to know that I am God who makes you holy. Going back to language from from Genesis 2, 1 and 2. Now you shall observe the Sabbath. Its desecrated shall be put to death. Now we're bringing some of that Babylonian. It's God's day. It's the Lord's day. So on one hand, it's a gift to you, but it is God's day. Don't violate it. This is some of that Babylonian dread comes in that you don't find in the Jeremiah version, but you definitely find it in the version here. It says, for 6 days work may be done. The seventh day is a day of complete rest, uh, sacred to God. Now go to verse 16. Uh, the Israelites will observe the Sabbath to make the Sabbath an eternal covenant. Eternal covenant, it's the covenant of the Sabbath that goes back to the days of creation. It is forever a 6 day period. God made heavens and the earth. And the seventh day, God rested and refreshed. Shabbat vayi nafash. So he was like, how could it be that God would rest vayi nafash? Apparently, taken straight from Babylonian mythology, that when people would observe these Lord's days, the Babylonian God was able to rest because human beings were living according to the divine will. So again, as I'm reading the discovery of these ancient cuneiform tablets, when one person reads, God rested on the Sabbath, they said, we found the origin of the Sabbath. And then it said God rested from being angry at the people or upsetting the God. So the Sabbath was a day where God stopped being angry and rested. That's Babylonian. And here we have this strange idea that the Sabbath day, God, as in fact, the Babylonian says the heart of God, the God rested. The heart of the God rested. So they're not trying to explain it. They're just saying the heart, again, borrowing from Babylonia, the heart of God rested on the Sabbath day. Therefore, by extension, our hearts can rest on the Sabbath day. Shabbat vayinafash. Now remember, they're not trying to solve it. They're not trying to explain it. They're using, again, verbal and artifacts from other cultures, bringing them in, mixing them up for our own purposes, producing our culture, not trying to solve any problem, but definitely taking an ancient institution, reworking it so it fits completely within the Israelite idea that divine cessation is a cosmic act that is, again, bequeathed to the human beings so that we can rest as well, and also declare ourselves to being part of this divine order to push back tohu vavohu. All right, got all that out. So we finished my first section of my teaching, Genesis chapter 1.